And in the beginning of it all, a boy named Haru explains the nostalgia many people have for high school, as it was during that time that many people created precious memories. However, Houtaro believes that many students wouldn't like to remember their lives during that period, such as himself, who doesn't like studying, sports, or social clubs. Because of this, one of his classmates calls him passive, someone who is always just conserving his energy. Furthermore, the boy reminds Houtaro of one of his most famous mottos, the well-known "I don't do anything I don't need to do, and what I need to do, I do quickly." But as they talk, Houtaro reveals that he will join the classic literature club at his sister's request, as the club was at risk of being closed due to its small membership. And upon arriving at the classic literature club, he encounters a girl who introduces herself as Chitanda and says that they already know each other from somewhere. Houtaro tries to remember where he knows her from and notices that she's the girl who only had one music lesson with his class. Therefore, he deduces that she simply has a good memory. During their conversation, he discovers that she also joined the same club, but she chooses not to reveal her reasons for doing so. Houtaro hurries home, but on his way to the door, Chitanda notices someone else listening to their conversation. The boy enters the room and says he was curious to know what Houtaro was talking about, since he was alone with a girl. As for Chitanda, she asks about that boy, and Houtaro introduces him as Fukube Satoshi, a boy who thinks he's world famous. Fukube is surprised to hear the girl's name, since Chitanda is from one of Kamiyama's oldest families. But upon hearing this, Chitanda realizes the boy is just making things up after all. She'd never heard of her family's fame. Seeing her fueling the conversation, Fukube continues, saying that the eldest daughter of the Chitanda family is known for being a very beautiful and intelligent young woman, and as for himself, Fukube says he's seen her name listed as an honor student many times. Continuing the conversation, Fukube notices that Chitanda is locked in the room and says he knows what happened. However, Houtaro simply ignores him and decides to go home immediately. But Chitanda steps in front of him and says she still wants to know why the door was locked with her inside. As they walk a little further down the corridors looking for information, they notice a man working and locking the doors as soon as he finishes his work in each room. From this, Houtaro deduces that Chitanda entered the room while that man was working and ended up locked in, due to bad luck. However, Houtaro is still surprised that Chitanda didn't hear the door closing. She then takes him to the window and says she was distracted looking at an old house on the horizon. After leaving the room, Chitanda invites Fukube to join the classic literature club as well, and he readily accepts, even though he's already in other clubs. They then begin to discuss the issue of the presidency and who should assume the position. But while they talk, Houtaro stays behind thinking about how his life has taken a turn he didn't want, and then he resolves not to give up on his peace and feels he needs to find a way to get back to his peaceful life from before. And the very next day, Fukube begins to recount a story that students often tell. And he begins the story by telling about a schoolgirl while walking to a music room, begins to hear the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but as soon as she reaches the room, the music stops, and then a monstrous girl stares at her with her hair covering her face. And after finishing telling his made-up story, Fukube mentions a story he heard from Chitanda about a ghost that actually exists at that school. This would be the story of the school's second mystery. Hearing this, Houtaro deduces that there must be a first mystery, since there is a second. He then asks his friend to tell him, but in the middle of the conversation, Chitanda appears with her completed form, as that's her job as club president. During the conversation, Houtaro reminds them about the secret club the students have been talking about. Of all the club flyers in the school, only one is for an unauthorized club that secretly recruits new members. And although they don't know exactly what this club does, the students at least know it exists. Having said all that, Fukube reveals his name, the Golden Web. As for Houtaro, he suggests going after the pamphlet for that club, and they arrive at the main notice board, located at the beginning of the corridors. As soon as he sees all those colorful pamphlets full of information, Houtaro starts to feel nauseous. Chitanda notices that this location would be perfect for an unauthorized pamphlet, as it would blend in with the others. While vaguely searching for the pamphlet, they can't find it, leading Fukube to deduce that they must be using some kind of secret code to deceive the council. While rummaging through the pamphlets, Houtaro discovers the Golden Web pamphlet underneath another one. Fukube simply removes the Golden Web pamphlet, and they all head home. On the way, Fukube reveals that Houtaro actually planted the pamphlet there, and asks why he made such a big deal out of the mystery. Houtaro then reminds him of his slogan, which dictates that he should do what needs to be done quickly and without delay. Therefore, this was the way he found to solve the mystery more quickly. As their conversation continues, Fukuba asks what he thinks of the mystery in the music room. Houtaro briefly mentions the mystery, which involves a pianist with messy hair and sleepy red eyes. The girl decides to go to sleep and sets her CD player to wake her up a little before 6, but the CD player still hasn't started playing. Fukuba notes that it would have been less energy intensive if they had solved that mystery instead of the Golden Web one. After a month of the Classic Literature Club's revival, Houtaro grew accustomed to the club's routine and decided to continue attending, as long as it didn't become tiresome. As for Chitanda, she felt she was wasting her time with the club, as they were simply going without any particular goal. Therefore, she decided to set a goal for them. The Classic Literature Club would present a collection of classic books at the October Cultural Festival, and although Houtaro feels that this will be a lot of work, he decides to help her anyway. And so the two begin searching for references in the club's previous book collections, and seeing that there is nothing there, Chitanda decides to continue the search in the school library. And when they arrive there, they are approached by Fukuba, who immediately starts playing some pranks on Ibara, the librarian. At that point, Chitanda notices a certain awkwardness between the two and asks what's wrong. Houtaro then explains that Ibara has liked Fukuba since elementary school. And moving on to the main topic of conversation, Chitanda asks the librarian about the collections published by the Classic Literature Club, but Ibara says she doesn't have much information on that. At that moment, Fukuba interrupts the conversation, and upon hearing them talking about the cultural festival, he notices that the club will be participating in the Kanya Festival, which surprises him, since he didn't imagine Houtaro would agree to it. As for Ibara, she thinks more about what Chitanda had asked her and says that perhaps they can find something about the collections published by the Classic Literature Club in the archives. But since the teacher is in a meeting, she won't be able to leave for the next 30 minutes, so everyone decides to wait for the teacher's return and to pass the time. Ibara tells them about a book that lives in the return basket, and although the book could stay with the students for up to 2 weeks, it was always returned sooner. And upon reading the document showing which students borrowed the book, Chitanda notices that it's always different students who borrow the book, but they always return it on the same day. Chitanda becomes interested in the case and asks Houtaro to help her solve it, since he is very clever about these things. When he tries to refuse, he notices she insists even more, and he eventually gives in. After thinking a bit more about what he can tell Chitanda, he questions everyone about the other uses a book has besides being read. Hearing this, Chitanda deduces that the book has some other use they are unaware of. Meanwhile, Houtaro continues his analysis of what's happening and notices that the names of the people who took the book are all girls. As for Chitanda, she starts to smell a strong odor of paint thinner on the book. Houtaro tells Chitanda to go to the art room, but she pulls him along with her. Before they can leave, Ibara asks Fukuba to stay in the library, as she will also be going with them. On the way there, Houtaro says that these 5 students will probably meet in art class, since they are from different classes. Upon arriving, they discover that the girls were using that book as a stencil for their paintings, which explains the smell of paint on the book. Returning to the library, everyone begins to admire Houtaro for discovering something so difficult. And as for the Chitanda, she says she would like to see inside his head, just to understand how it works. However, Houtaro states that she wouldn't have anything to see there, since she is a brilliant student. And although she knows of her abilities, Chitanda says she wants to understand more things, such as the birth of thoughts. But while listening to her speak, Houtaro remains intrigued by the fact that she managed to smell that scent from before. And suddenly, the teacher finally returns from the meeting, and then Fukuba takes the opportunity to ask about the references to the old collections of the Classic Literature Club. But upon hearing this, the teacher explains that there is nothing in the archives. The next day, Chitanda calls Houtaro to talk somewhere, but when they meet, she remains silent. Unsure how to begin the conversation, Houtaro threatens to leave, but then sarcastically asks if she's there to confess her feelings. Chitanda replies affirmatively. And when Chitanda asks to be heard by him, her request is granted, and then she asks for his help to remember something her uncle said. But upon hearing this, Houtaro says he can't help her with something so complex. At that point, Chitanda realizes she skipped some parts of the story and begins talking about a trip her uncle took to India 7 years ago, and since then, no one has heard from him. When she was in kindergarten, Chitanda learned that her uncle, Seikatani-jun, had also been in the Classic Literature Club. One day, she found a book and asked her uncle about the club, but Seikatani simply turned his face away and avoided answering. However, Chitanda began to cry, and so her uncle finally decided to tell her everything. Chitanda remembers crying even more when she heard the answer, but she doesn't remember anything Seikatani said to her. As a last resort, she decided to join the literature club to research something that might have happened 45 years ago, when her uncle was in the same club. However, Chitanda remained without answers, as no one else remembered anything that could have occurred so long ago. At this point, Chitanda appeals to Houtaro's intelligence and asks him to solve the mystery for her. However, Houtaro decides not to take on this responsibility and suggests that she ask her friends for help. But upon hearing this, Chitana explains that this situation can't be discussed with just anyone. And since Houtaro somewhat resembles her uncle, Chitana believes he can help her more easily. Houtaro then notes that the 3 years of high school ahead are enough time for them to investigate the case. However, he decides not to take on that responsibility for her. But even so, Houtaro promises to keep her informed if anything relevant about the case comes to his attention. After that, back at school, Houtaro and the others enter the exam period, but after a few days, Houtaro finishes all the exams and lies down on his bed to rest from the activities. Until suddenly, he remembers the letter he received from his sister and begins to read it. In it, she asks if he intends to present an anthology at the cultural fair. After all, the Classic Literature Club always had this tradition back when she was a member. Regarding the old literary collections, Tomo says they're no longer in the library, but he can still find them in the club room in a locked safe. When he mentions this to the girls, they say they've never seen a safe there. But Houtaro explains that the room has changed a lot since his sister graduated, and in fact, the old club room was in the biology classroom, so that's where they should focus their search for the safe. But upon arriving at the location, they encounter the representative of the place, which has now become the news club. Chitana gets straight to the point, saying they're looking for the old anthologies of the Classic Literature Club. However, the boy starts sweating and says that the anthologies they are looking for are no longer there. The boy continues to insist that they stay away from his club, but Ibarra reminds him that before being a club room, it's just a classroom. Hearing this, the boy eventually gives in and lets them search the room. But in the middle of the search, Houtaro asks if they took anything from the room when they arrived. At that point, the boy replies yes, and then Houtaro decides to bluff him, saying that he will call the class counselor to help them look for the anthologies. But upon hearing this, the boy refuses immediately and starts shouting, saying because their anthologies are not in that room. Seeing the boy's explosive reaction, Houtaro reveals that the anthologies are actually in a safe, so he asks the boy to bring them if he finds them. They leave the room and return 5 minutes later, finding all the anthologies neatly arranged on the table, having solved the case. Houtaro explains that the boy had already set up a kind of sensor in the hallway, placing the boxes there. As for the device with the antenna in the room, Houtaro deduces that it was the receiver. Furthermore, he believes the safe was under those cardboard boxes in the middle of the room, where the anthologies and the cigarette the boy was illegally hiding were kept. And as for the smell of smoke, he would be using that air purifier to disguise it. That said, Houtaro understands why the boy got so angry when he suggested bringing a counselor to help search for the safe. After all, that would end up revealing the cigarettes he's hiding in the room. After Chitana enters the room, she brings Houtaro the book she had given to her uncle and asks him to read it. He reads a text written from another person's perspective, in which she recounts that Seikatani left the place a year ago, becoming part of classical literature, just as everyone there will one day become. At the end of the text, the person introduces themselves as Kuriyama Yuko and states that they were writing this on October 13, 1964. As they discuss the matter further, Houtaro suggests that Chitana investigate volume 1 of that book, as she might find another relevant quote there. However, Ibarra notices that volume 1 is the only one missing from the entire collection, and in a conversation with Houtaro, Chitana is convinced to ask her friends for help with her uncle's case. They all decide to help her immediately, having become interested in the mystery. As for Houtaro, he suggests making the case an official club activity, because if they do good research, they can use it as the theme for that year's anthology. After class, Houtaro and Fukuba cycle to Chitana's house. As they sit down to begin the meeting, Chitana asks them to gather data and reports from the entire group, so they can then raise questions about these documents, and subsequently create their theories about the facts. Chitana begins by presenting the information from her report, stating that her uncle left school without graduating. She then goes on to say that her uncle's story grew over time, transforming him into a legend. Finally, Chitana comments on a sacrifice made by her uncle, but decides to leave that subject aside for now. However, in the end, Chitana theorizes about a struggle her uncle had against something, and the end result was his withdrawal from the school. In addition to this theory, Chitana presents another. Since Seikatani left the school during the Canyon Festival, she believes someone at the event threatened him, demanding money, and in response, her uncle resisted forcefully, and because of this, he ended up being treated as a hero. But soon after, he took responsibility for his actions and ended up leaving the school. As for the students who witnessed this at the time, they chose to keep that story to themselves, alive in those collections of the Classic Literature Club. And when they finish listening to all of Chitana's questioning, they realize she is wrong. Houtaro then reminds her that her initial suggestion for the cultural festival was to set up a food stall, but she herself had told him that such things were prohibited at the event. Therefore, the circulation of money at the festival was certainly minimal, so there is no possibility that any bandit could have appeared at the event and threatened her uncle in this way. As for Fukuba, he explains that the gangsters of the 1960s weren't fighting against teachers or students, but against the system and the government. Upon hearing this, Houtaro scoffs at his friend, saying that he wasn't even around back then to be saying such things. However, Fukuba reminds him that he did some research on that period. As for Chitanda, she notes that he's right, as she hadn't considered the political climate of the time then. Ibara moves on and gives Houtaro a book from 44 years ago, which is from the same period as Chitanda's research. That said, she begins to read the manuscript, which starts by saying we, in this case referring to the students, and as for the adjectives restrictive or authoritarian, these words refer to the teachers. Continuing with the story, the person in question comments on a certain class war that took place in the middle of the previous year and was led by the president of the Classic Literature Club, Seikatani-jun. And because of the activism of these students, this ended up causing many problems for the teachers. Having said all that, she moves on to her theory, explaining that Chitanda's uncle apparently left the school because of a violent confrontation that occurred 45 years ago after the students' freedom was taken away. But upon hearing her entire theory, Houtaro notices that something doesn't add up. After all, the class struggle incident occurred in June, yet Seikatani remained at the school without being expelled until October, which doesn't make sense. If he left the school as punishment for a violent incident he instigated, it should have happened in June. As they move on to Fukubi's report, he complains of hunger, so they go to the kitchen, and Chitanda starts preparing some rice balls while her friends continue with their theories. However, Fukuba immediately apologizes to Ibara, as his research completely contradicts hers. After all, he believes that the students did not use violence to oppose the teachers, but only disobedience. During a break for questions, Houtaro asks him about this legendary movement and whether it was the same one Seikatani was involved in, since the material he used to form his theory says nothing about it. At this point, Fukuba is at a loss for words and simply says that he has no way to prove his theory. However, Ibara says that they still have a lot of indirect evidence. After all, if these two events were separated, the students would have referred to the legendary movement as something more specific. With that said, they ask Fukuba to continue with his theory, but the boy says he wasn't able to create any theory based solely on these facts. When it's Houtaro's turn, he starts sweating profusely because he hasn't prepared anything very useful to present, and so he asks to go to the bathroom. He uses this opportunity to think more carefully about the facts and see where he can go with them. Upon returning to the meeting, Houtaro says he was unable to formulate any theory, so he decides to simply present the facts he could find. In doing so, he provides a recap stating that the students, perhaps led by Seikatani-jun, they had rebelled against something, which probably it was the teachers, and according to Ibara, the revolt was because their freedom was being threatened. Having said all that, Houtaro states that the reason for the incident was the cultural festival, since back in June, the students had a meeting with the teachers to discuss this matter. Houtaro's guess is that the students revolted because the principal wanted to shorten the cultural festival, which was only 5 days, making the event even shorter. As for Seikatani, he fostered the activism that ultimately defeated the authoritarians. But all of this was done only through boycotts, leaving aside any violent acts. In the end, the school agreed with the students and reversed the idea of shortening the cultural festival, but the price they paid for it was the expulsion of the hero, Seikatani-jun. However, he was only expelled for months later precisely to avoid another major revolt by the students. And after they finished listening to his entire theory, no one could refute his arguments. And so Chitanda decided to use his theory to form the theme of their anthology. And although everything was resolved, Chitanda still wondered why she cried when Seikatani told her that story. And while returning home with Houtaru, Satoshi says he was surprised to see Hisa friend is trying to solve that Kanya festival case. But he believes that the reason Houtaru is doing this is because of Chitanda. However, Houtaru explains that he simply can't stand his monotonous life when he's around them, so he's willing to participate and experience everything his friends are going through. Upon hearing this, Satoshi deduces that he is envious of people who lead a more lively lifestyle. As soon as he gets home, Houtaru questions whether he truly wants to be like Chitanda or Seikatani, but ultimately he remains without an answer to that question. Then he remembers his sister, who also lives a hectic life. Speaking of her, he receives a phone call from his sister, who informs him that she is going to Sarajevo and will keep him updated as soon as she arrives. As for Houtaru, he tells his sister that he is putting together an anthology based on HYOUKA, and their research focuses on Seikatani's life. As soon as he mentions that name, Houtaru's sister reveals she knows something about him. Houtaru asks her to tell him everything she knows about Seikatani, but she hangs up on him, saying she doesn't have time to talk. He then throws his phone to the ground, calling his sister useless, and afterwards, Haotoru reflects on his theory about Seikatani, wondering if he truly wouldn't have regretted anything if he were still alive. After all, he sacrificed himself for his passion for school and his friends, thus earning the nickname Gentle Hero. After thinking about it a bit more, Haotoru believes that not every hero could forgive the situation they went through so easily. Therefore, he sets out to find out if Seikatani is also one of those embittered heroes. The next day, already at school, he calls Abara and Satoshi to the club room, and as soon as everyone is gathered there, Haotoru reveals that he has gained access to more information about the Seikatani case. And with that, he states that it's now possible to draw a conclusion. The whole case. That being said, Her states that he may have formed his theory from the wrong perspective, or perhaps he missed something. In this, he points to a kanji in the HYOUKA book and says that it can be read as sacrifice or offering. Upon hearing this, Satoshi says that there's no way they can know the exact meaning of the text. After all, only the person who wrote it should know. Utaro then reminds him that they can simply find the person and ask them directly what that kanji means, since the person responsible for writing that preface is Kuriyama Yuko, who now goes by the name Itoagawa. And besides these questions involving the HYOUKA book, Utaro says that they might also be able to find out what happened to Chitana's uncle. As for Satoshi, he asks if Haotoru is sure that Itoagawa wrote the book's preface. Haotoru, in turn, reveals that he has spoken with Itoagawa before and arranged to meet her at the library shortly. With that said, everyone goes to the library to speak with her, and as soon as they begin the conversation, Itoagawa immediately understands the students' intentions and asks why they want to know about the protests that occurred so long ago. At that point, Chitana reveals that Seikatani-jun, the most influential student in that protest, is her uncle, and since he disappeared in India, she wants to know more about him, hoping to find him again. And so they go to Itoagawa's room, where Haotoru presents his theory about what he believes happened during the protest. After listening to him, Itoagawa is surprised by his level of deduction, as he was right about everything he said. Although he is completely correct, Haotoru remains thoughtful about something and asks if Seikatani voluntarily became the student's shield, only to be expelled from the school and hailed as a hero. Hearing this question, Itoagawa begins a complete recap of the uprising 45 years ago, explaining that the students' revolt was due to the principal shortening the festival from 5 days to 3. A committee was formed to oppose the director's decision to shorten the festival, but no one wanted to lead it, as the leader would ultimately suffer the greatest consequences. Seikatani was chosen by the students to lead the committee. As the protest intensified, the students decided to set fire to the area near the school to further demonstrate the power of their revolt. However, the fire got out of control, burning down the school's dojo and surrounding buildings. As a result, Seikatani, the committee's public leader, was chosen to be expelled from the school, serving as an example to the other students. But as time went by, the festival ended up being shortened to 3 days anyway. And upon hearing the whole explanation, Haotoru comments on the dojo and why it was rebuilt. However, Itoagawa says that in fact, the dojo wasn't that old when the school was rebuilt. Therefore, it hadn't been touched since then. And regarding Swadoshi, he notices that the word Kanya from the festival has a kanji that can be read as Seikatani. Thus, the name of the event would be Seikatani Festival, in honor of the hero who saved the whole class. Upon hearing this, Itoagawa says that this name has become taboo in classical literature. As for the book's title, HYOUKA, Itoagawa says he doesn't know its true meaning, and then Haotoru finally reveals it. What's behind that name in this case is it's just a pun, since HYOUKA in English means ice cream, which in turn can be read as ice cream, a play on words between ice cream and ice cream, which only makes sense in English. And for Haotoru, Seikatani wanted to express her feeling of screaming in that situation, and upon hearing this explanation, Chitana finally remembers what her uncle told her when she asked the meaning of HYOUKA. He had asked her to stay strong, because only then would she still be able to scream. Upon returning to the literature room, they prepare an article that will reveal the mystery of the school, which occurred 45 years ago. Haotoru is assigned this task, even against his will, and as soon as he gets home, he writes to his sister again, saying that she was responsible for changing his lifestyle, because thanks to her sending him to the classic literature club, Haotoru began to have a routine he didn't have before. And so, on yet another school day, while listening to the teacher rambling, Kotaro feels bored, and then goes to the classical literature room, where he finds Abara arguing with Satoshi for some reason. Tired of this, the girl sits down to compose herself, and as they talk about Abara's tantrum, Satoshi suggests she learn from Chitanda, who never gets stressed regardless of the reason. Chitanda says she's never seen the boys angry either, but Satoshi says that he can get stressed eventually, but not with the same intensity as Abara. And if you listen to what Chitanda says, you'd be unable to imagine him being nervous. She starts to get curious about this, and as for Kotaro, he can already imagine Chitanda trying to make him nervous just to see how he reacts in that state. She wonders if Kotaro is also capable of getting nervous, but Abara says it would be impossible, since he wouldn't even have the energy enough to get worked up. And returning to Satoshi, he suggests that Ibarra control her anger. After all, anger, besides being harmful, is also one of the 7 deadly sins. Upon hearing this, Ibarra remembers that sloth is also one of the 7 sins, and Hotaru practices it all the time. As for Chitanda, they begin to praise her, saying that she doesn't seem to commit any of the 7 sins. At this point, the girl begins to feel embarrassed by so many compliments and asks them to stop. Seeing that she got angry, they realize that she ended up contradicting what they said about not practicing any of the sins. At this point, Chitanda calms down a little and explains that some of those sins are important to have. After all, both anger and pride can help them a lot. Because if a person doesn't have a shred of pride, they won't have the slightest self-confidence. And if a person never gets angry about anything, it's a sign that they don't love either. Nothing. Upon seeing this, Ibarra asks why she almost never gets stressed, and Chitanda replies, saying that she prefers to conserve energy. Noticing her acting like Hotaru, Ibarra and Satoshi begin to panic. Believing that there's some kind of sloth yokai roaming the school, Chitanda calms them down, saying she was just joking. After all, she really does get nervous about some things, like when she sees people wasting energy. Food. When Hotaru, Chitanda remembers the time she argued with Professor Omitsu in class, and seeing this, she realizes she has something to ask him. But first, she contextualizes the argument they had. It happened during math class, but she doesn't remember exactly what made her angry. Having said that, Chitanda recalls each step the professor took before starting the class. He began by writing an equation on the board and then called on Kawasaki to solve it. However, since part of the material hadn't yet been taught, the boy decided to continue in his place, as he wouldn't be able to answer the question. When he tried to call on other students, Omitsu became even more irritated because no one could get to the board to solve the problem. Seeing the professor so agitated, Chitanda takes action and asks Omitsu to check how much of the material he had taught, since he was giving a problem they hadn't yet learned to solve. The professor checks his notes, and seeing that he really hadn't covered that material, Omitsu, after apologizing to the class and recounting the whole story, Chitanda asked Hotaru why her teacher made such a mistake, given how careful he usually is. Hotaru ignores this, saying she doesn't know why Omitsu acted that way, but after much insistence, he decides to help her unravel the mystery. Remembering that Omitsu usually takes notes in his notebook after class, Hotaru deduces that on the day he got angry, Omitsu must have simply seen the wrong class's notes, causing the confusion. However, Ibarra points out that if Omitsu had confused the notes, he would have covered material already covered, not new material. Meanwhile, Chitanda continues to ponder what could have made her upset with the teacher, as everything Ibarra suggests isn't enough to have caused her to lose her temper. Continuing her investigation, Hotaru discovers that the material Omitsu gave to Chitanda's class has already been given to Satoshi's class. Therefore, he believes that the professor must have confused these two classes and passed the old material from Satoshi's Class D to Chitanda's Class A, which hadn't yet learned the material. Because of his confusion with the notes, Hotaru deduces that he wrote the letters A and D in lowercase, thus confusing the two letters, since they are very similar and easy for an Asian person to confuse. Having said that, he finally solves the case and deduces that Chitanda was curious about it because she wanted to find out what had irritated her. After all, she doesn't like feeling that way. Everyone has those days, right? When like anything irritates you. Everything. The world woke up on the wrong side of the bed. But if you're not in that situation and you're enjoying the anime so far, leave a like, subscribe, and comment below so I can bring you the complete season, because there's still a lot to come and a lot of water to flow under the bridge. And I'll definitely see you in the next video. Bye.